Welcome to episode 433 of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I interview Luke Watson. Luke is the performance head coach of the National Triathlon Performance Centre Wales in Cardiff, which is a development environment for elite short course and long course triathlete. He also has plenty of experience working with age group athletes, so today's interview spans topics across both elite and age group triathlon. But before we get into the interview with Luke, big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Fuel and Hydration. They create carbohydrate and electrolyte products that are effective, practical, and tasty, and they are the official hydration partner of the 2024 Ironman and Ironman 70.3 European Series races, including the Ironman World Championships in Nice. Athletes with questions about nailing their race nutrition strategy at Ironman European Series events can book a free video consultation with the athlete support team or use the free race hydration and nutrition planner on the Precision Fuel and Hydration website, where details about each specific Ironman European Series event has been added and included in the planner. As a listener, you can get 15% off your first order by using the code TTS24 on precisionfuelandhydration.com. And thank you to Senate. The Senate indoor swim trainer allows you to improve your technique, power, and swim training consistency. The great thing about the Senate is that it is so versatile, so you can make it work to suit your swim-specific needs. For a lot of athletes, the primary need may be to work on technique, whereas for others, it might be to improve force and power. The Zenate allows you to do either or even both at the same time, and they have a great library of video-guided workouts that you can pick and choose from to find the ones that best suit your needs. Try the Zenate risk-free for up to 30 days and get 20% off your first order on senateswimtrainer.com/TTS. One final thing before the interview, I'd like to ask you that if you enjoy the podcast, please share it with your friends, help the podcast grow. And if you can also leave a 5-star rating and review in Spotify or Apple Podcasts, that would be even better. These things really go a long way to helping the podcast keep growing and ultimately keep it sustainable and keep it coming out on a regular basis. So thank you very much for your help with spreading the word about That Triathlon Show if you choose to do so. Now, without any further ado, here's the interview with Coach Luke Watson. Welcome to That Triathlon Show, Luke. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you. Great to have an on-air conversation. Can you start by giving the listeners an introduction to yourself and what do you do?
Yeah, so I'm Luke Watson. So I'm the performance head coach for Welsh Triathlon. So on a day-to-day basis, that means I run the National Triathlon Performance Centre in Cardiff in Wales. That's a partnership between ourselves as Welsh Triathlon and the two Cardiff-based universities, so Cardiff Met and Cardiff Uni. We've got a range of national and international elite athletes in that squad. Some of them student athletes, some of them professionals. We've got quite a few different countries represented. So, the majority of them are either Welsh or British, but we've got athletes from Barbados, Australia and Japan in our program here. Also, I've got kind of overall responsibility for the Welsh senior program, including things like the Commonwealth Games. And I work with British Triathlon at camps and competitions. So I've been the lead coach for the last 2 years for the World Under 23 Championships. And I've just been out to Yokohama for the WTS race for British Triathlon. So that's kind of the summary of my day-to-day work and responsibilities.
Yeah, it's a good summary. And I believe that you also work a bit on the side in long course triathlon, or at least you have done so with coaching both amateur and professional athletes in long course racing.
Yeah, so we've got some in our squad. There's a mixture of athletes that race short course and long course. So on the long course side, we've got Yasin Harriet, who won Challenge Gran Canaria the other week. Josh Lewis was the 5th place in the world 70.3 champs last year. So we've got a couple of long course athletes, and they're part of our program. They train with us full time. And then I guess, the majority of the group are short course athletes, either at a high level nationally or just kind of in that international scene. So we've got Matthew Wright from Barbados, who's pretty close to confirming qualification for Paris. I guess depends on when this goes out, whether he hopefully will have done by then. And then some of them like up and coming British talent. So Dom Coy was 3rd at World Junior Championships in 2021. We've got Tilly Anima, who was 5th at European Under 23s, 6th at World Under 23s last year. and a couple of other developing athletes there. So we've got like a mix of short course, long course, national, international athletes in the group.
Yeah. And do you work at all with amateurs at the moment, or is that something that you've done more in the past?
Yeah, not so much now. But when I was, a few years ago, before I started this full-time job, I was coaching every different thing to do with triathlon, from the local kids club to I did some swim clinics. I did some private one-to-one coaching. So I in that time, that few years, I pretty much coached every different type of triathlete, from just a kid just starting out to a novice adult to people that were going to the Olympics or the Paralympics.
All right. So let's get the hardest question of the interview out of the way. We just agreed to call it coaching methodology and training philosophy, I believe. So what is your coaching methodology and training philosophy?
Yeah, I guess as we were chatting about, for me, I'd divide them into two things. I think like the coaching methodology is more the like how you do things. The training philosophy is what do you actually end up doing. So if I kind of take them one by one in that sense. So I guess from a coaching methodology point of view, I think I guess I've got like a little framework that I'd go through if I was working with a new athlete, or kind of at the start of each year with an athlete, even if I've been working with them for a while. So the first thing's about just, I guess, building the relationship and understanding the person, them understanding you, contracting expectations, being clear about the purpose of what you're trying to get out of it. Why do they do the sport? Those kind of things. That's a bit more bigger picture, because I think that can really have quite a big impact on some of the decisions that you take and the way that you work with them, and obviously how you work as a coach. Like I think people talk about, it's always the coach's job to like flex to whatever the athlete needs, but I think it's maybe a bit more nuanced than that, and it's about you as a pair will come in to an understanding of how you're going to work together and get the most out of each other. So I think even if you've been working with athletes for a number of years, I think it's important to kind of keep revisiting that, keep evolving that relationship as you go through that coaching relationship. So again, I guess once you've done that, for me, it's about understanding demands. So what are they trying to achieve, and really, really specifically, what does it take to do that? So before you can start putting a plan together of what you're doing, it's like actually what, if someone turns up and goes, I want a podium in a Continental Cup, or I want to, Josh, I want to qualify for, and I want to go to deliver the best performance I can at the 70.3 Worlds. Or, want to swim and ride in the front pack, and what does that actually look like? What speeds do you need to be able to hit? What powers do you need to be able to hit? Like, and being, I think that's something that we do fairly well in our group, is just being super clear on the demands of competition for whatever it is that our athletes are working towards. Because once you've done that, you can then start the individual profiling. So where are they relative to the goals that they're setting? So, whether that's physical, technical, psychological, you're having a really clear idea of where they are in all of those parameters versus the demands that you've set for those goals. And then I suppose if you've done that, you probably just need to make sure that the goal is still realistic, because it might be, for example, you sit down with an athlete and they come and they go, well, I want to achieve this. But when you work out the gap between where they are and where they need to be, that what they put as a 1-year goal might actually need to be a 2-year goal or a 3-year goal in order to get there. So I always find it quite useful at that point to go back and just kind of check that those goals are realistic, achievable. I mean, rarely it would be that the athletes underset their goals, but it is possible. It has happened from time to time, but normally athletes are very much sort of shoot for the moon in that respect. And so then once you've got that, you've identified the gaps. Where the athlete is, so where they need to be. Then that's just where you build your plan and sort of try and create that together. I think from my point of view as a coach, you've got there's like a spectrum of how you can work with an athlete, and it's not what's right for one athlete isn't always right for everyone. So, I'd say that, from my role, it can range almost from like an instructor, like with a very new athlete, it's like, this is, they don't know a lot. So it's just, this is what you need to do, like quite, direct instructional, all the way through to like some of the more experienced athletes. It's much more like a consultant, for example, where they would come with their own ideas and their own opinions, and they're kind of more asking for your advice. And, most people would sit somewhere along that spectrum, but that's part of that kind of coaching practice, is just to make sure that you're both clear on how you're working together. Because it's no good me being an advisor to someone who literally hasn't got a clue what they're doing and needs a bit more direct input, if that makes sense. And then you put your plan together in that way, and then it's just, I suppose, really basic, like plan, do, review, execute it, see how it's going, come back to it, revise the targets. If you've seen stuff that means that either the goals or the standards have changed, we saw that when we came out of COVID, there was just huge changes in the dynamics of racing. The bike level was much higher. The super shoes were having a massive effect on the run times, and so you had to kind of recalibrate your expectations of what was A, possible, and B, necessary from a competition point of view. So that's probably that from a coaching methodology point of view. Is there anything you want to ask?
Yeah, that's going back to one of those points, the plan, do, review. That's a good catchy slogan, not a slogan, but phrase. So at what levels does that happen? Do you have multiple nested levels, like you have a bigger plan, do, review from a year perspective, but then also from, let's say, a monthly or mesocycle perspective, and potentially even my microcycle perspective, or is it more, let's say, organic at those lower levels and more formal at the higher levels? Can you talk a little bit more in detail about that?
Yeah, I would love to say I had a really clear kind of, hierarchical setup of how I do that planning process, but I'd be lying. I think we have a pretty clear setup of, the big picture of the year. These are roughly how it's going to break down around kind of an athlete's key objectives, and and then really within that, I think, especially in being a full-time coach and working with athletes that are a lot of them are full-time or nearly full-time, you're seeing them a lot, you can adapt things a lot more quickly. So I'd probably try and plan on a month, kind of roughly, this is what we want to do in this month, and then you do the detailed plan each week. But by the time you get to one set, you can plan this session even on a Friday for the following Monday, and something's happened at the weekend, someone's come in, they're a bit more tired than you thought, you've got to make those changes on the fly. So I would probably spend more of my time and energy focusing at that level, rather than kind of putting hours into making a really, step-by-step, detailed plan for the next 3 months. And then you get a couple of weeks in and they've got a niggle, or their race calendar's changed, or, whatever, and you've got to rip that up again. I think, we'd spend a lot of time going around in circles in that if I did it that way. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that it does. So basically, decision making, how you react to things that happen, is where it's really worth to put more effort, rather than exact planning especially that is farther out. That makes,
I think
makes total sense.
If you've got a clear enough, if you've done the first process well enough around, like, this is what we're trying to achieve, this is where we're trying to go, you've got a clear enough understanding of what it is that you're trying to achieve, then that, like, the decisions that you take and the adaptations you make are like framed by that a lot better. And there's only so far wrong you can go if you keep that as your kind of North Star, I suppose, and you're just trying to almost like steer the ship towards that all the time. And I don't think you need that real, you don't need to be planning detail on a kind of like 3-month basis or whatever, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So training philosophy, what are overarching thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess for me, there's a few kind of principles. Maybe I should have called it principles rather than philosophy. Philosophy feels a bit bit more high level than maybe it is. But yeah, I think for me, it's like, for the sport that we do, it's fundamentally is an engine sport, and that's true whether you're racing short course, long course, elite, age group, or whatever. We are fundamentally an endurance engine sport, so you've got to make sure that is dialed into the optimum of whatever your demands of competition are. And for most of triathlon, that means that, you know, having as high threshold as possible is important. There's obviously a whole bunch of sort of technical, tactical, you know, movement quality, all of that kind of thing that sits with that as well. But I think being really clear on what your physiological demands are and making sure that your training is meeting those is really important. I think the management of high intensity work, and I would probably used to have called that intensity control, but most people would probably think of that as like always trying to like stop people from going harder, which is true for a lot of people. But you know, we've got guys who need more high intensity work, and because that's just the way that their profile is. So I'd probably call it management of the high intensity work. You need...
with high intensity here, do you refer to anything in the severe domain, or is it even things like threshold work? Do you count that as high intensity as well?
And anything, when I say high intensity work, I basically mean anything over LT1. So if you use I know Stephen Silas 3-zone model or 5-zone model. So 5-zone model, it'd be anything from zone 3, 4, 5. 3-zone model, it'd be anything in zone 2 and 3. So it's basically anything that's not aerobic work. I think you need to be really clear on what you're doing, when you're doing it, what in actually specific intensity that you're trying to target with that, and what that athlete needs, because the demands from a competition point of view and the individual's profile and their own needs can be vastly different. You know, we've got short course athletes who, some of them pretty much never need to touch anything over LT2, because they've just got such an enormous anaerobic capability, and you know, they've got a massive VO2 max, and so you know, they can just spend their entire time optimizing from a threshold point of view. And we've got some athletes that they need a lot of that, you know, zone 5 really hard stuff. So I think it's just being super clear on the individual and the demand, and making sure that you're matching those two up, which obviously coaching within a group, you've then got to be quite creative about how you set up sessions so that everybody can get what they need from that session. So
how do you do that? So if you take the swim as an example, because I find that's you probably, it's usually a pretty hard one, especially because you then have to share lanes normally based on your level. On a track, it might be a bit easier to individualize, but in the pool, when you not only have multiple people, but you also have maybe 2 people that swim the same speed, but one is very gifted with VO2 max and at really high intensity, and another one is more aerobically dominant but really weak on the VO2 max side of things, but they might be swimming in the same lane. What is your solution to individualize? How much does that happen?
Yeah, I mean, you've picked the most difficult like swimming is obviously the most difficult discipline to do it. Like the running, the biking to a lesser extent, the running especially is much more individual. I mean the running's super individual, just purely from the start point that some people in our group can run 40k a week and some people can run 100k a week, and so then what you can do with them from the rest of the training and the sessions, all that kind of thing is much more individual. The swimming, you have a constraint of, you know, depending on the session, 2 lanes or 4 lanes or whatever. But I think we would try and write sessions that can be done in a number of different ways, so that people can get what they need. So I'll give you an example. That session we're going to do tomorrow morning in the pool is 2 100s, 800, 3 100, 700, 4 1, 600, 5 1s, 500. And so if you divided people roughly into 2 boxes, it's obviously not quite as simple as that. But if you divided people into like the more anaerobic based athletes, the people that have got a lot of top ends, like good VO2 max, what I'd probably do with them is just pinch those in a little bit, so they'd not swim the hundreds quite as hard, and they'd swim the longer reps a bit more solid. So you're just trying to kind of develop that more, around the LT2 and just, optimize in that area. Whereas the people that need to work a little bit more on the top end would hit the hundreds harder and swim the long reps easier. And then you just arrange your lanes based on who's doing, how people are executing that session, and then what speed they would be if they do that. So yeah, I would say I try and work quite hard to write sessions that can be done in a number of different ways depending on what the person needs, and then it's then our job as myself and the other coaches to just make sure that you have that conversation with the athletes about how you want them to swim, so that they understand what they're trying to get from the session.
Yeah, that's very good. And another follow-up question on this is the thought process behind working on strengths and weaknesses and how to balance that.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because you see a lot that people would focus on, well, I'm weak at this, so I need to improve it. But if you're, especially at the elite level, or I guess if you're trying to win things or be really successful in any level, you need to have something that differentiates yourself from the rest of the competition. And so it's just trying to basically make the weaknesses. I think myself and the other coach, Adam in Loughborough, when we worked together, we came up with this kind of concept of red line, green line. And if you need to bring your weaknesses up to the red line, which is basically like, this is the minimum that you can get away with. And then you want to make your strengths over the green line, which was the concept of this is the thing that you can make a difference with. So you'll probably be good if you get everything between the red and the green line. There's nothing that's a significant weakness. You're probably not going to win anything. You're not going to medal. You're not going to impact the race unless you've got something or things that are over the green line, which is this is my strength. This is my thing that differentiates me from the rest of the competition. And so it's just, I guess, working out where each athlete is, go back to the kind of the profiling conversation and understanding where athletes are relative to that sort of profile, I suppose. And then that's how you set your prioritization. Because there's not a lot of point in having someone be an incredible runner if their swim is so far below the red line that they're in the last pack in every race, or they're not going to achieve the things that they want to unless we can get it to that level. But it's just trying to do that in a way, and at different periods through the year, that they're A, still developing in their areas that they're strong, and B, I think it's also giving them enough opportunities to do the things that they're good at. That's definitely something that I probably didn't do as well early on in my coaching career. There were some people that they needed to, they were great at the high intensity stuff, and they needed to develop the threshold a bit more. And so we spent all the time doing threshold, but they felt rubbish doing it. They weren't as fast as the other people. And so then, like, psychologically, they're like, well, I'm just rubbish, because I never kind of let them do enough, the things where they could just go and like let loose and just, smash all the other athletes and be like, oh, cool. Actually, there's some things that I'm good at here. And I think it's just getting that balance from a psychological point of view, but also so that when they go into racing, they can actually use their strengths still. And we never get too far away from that.
Yeah, no, I like that. The red line, green line concept is brilliant. And when it comes to for example, threshold, VO2 max, what are you working on? I think I find this extremely difficult, to be honest. Struggle with it sometimes to know, or to decide on what is the right thing to do. But I do think that it's easy to fall into the trap, or at least I have an easy time falling into the trap of, as you say, just keep giving the work that physiologically is a weakness for the athlete. But sometimes but I do feel that everything improves everything. So if you're an athlete that is strong in VO2 max, if you just work on those sorts of sessions that benefit your physiology, you will also improve your threshold, even if it's maybe not quite as specific as the classic threshold sessions, but it will be brought up by everything. Like, it's not the same way that you can't just, I don't know, get a six pack by just doing crunches all day long. I think the physiology is a bit the same, that it's not, you can't really target one specific thing, and that's exactly the outcome that you get. But it is, that's why, especially recently, I tried to ask this question about strengths and weaknesses, because I find it a difficult one, but a really important one to think about for coaches and for athletes.
Yeah, I definitely think that if you get stuck in thinking of training zones as like discrete things, then it's probably not, that you're probably kind of oversimplifying it. There's, everything, like you said, everything has an impact on everything else. It's just, you want to try and make sure that you're applying the stimulus in the area that you're looking to have the most effect, I suppose, and making sure that you've then got enough of the other stimuli to to get the adaptations that you want, I suppose. But I guess I find that to be one of the most interesting parts of coaching, is just trying to get that mix to be right, because you get it right for one athlete, you think you've nailed it, you've got the answer, but then you've got, we've got 17 athletes in our squad full time, and you're like, well, what works for one is just the complete opposite of what works for the others. And so you're just trying to make those individual tweaks all the time, and get the most out of each person.
Yeah. So more training principles that you wanted to chat about.
Yeah, I guess there's probably a couple more. I suppose one's linked to what we've just talked about around the management of the intensity work and around the profile strengths and weaknesses. I think the biggest thing is train where you are, not where you want to be. If you train where you are, you'll get to where you want to be. If you train where you want to be, then you're probably going too hard, and you're probably actually not getting the effect that you want. You're much more likely to get injured. It's much more likely to be unsustainable. And so that, I suppose, ego thing, especially when you're managing a bunch of different athletes in a group, it's really about helping athletes to understand what they're trying to get from the session and how they need to execute it, and having them focus on that rather than, well, yeah, but I could beat that person in this session. I know, but I don't want you to, because what you need to get out of it is this, and it's okay that they're doing that, and them doing that is because they need to do that for their own profile, their own their own strengths and weaknesses. And so I think that principle of just train where you're at, focus on yourself, especially in a group, is quite difficult to do, but it's super important. Otherwise, your whole sessions just get dragged to basically the level of the best athlete in the group, and everybody just basically tries to keep up with them for as long as they can in the session. They blow up, they don't finish, and therefore they've done half of the work that you could have accumulated if they hadn't have done that. So that's probably one. And then I would say kind of these things are all kind of related to each other, at least they are in my head. But sort of thinking about things on a more macro level, I think athletes, people in general, but athletes especially, get drawn into how was that session, how was this session, how good was it compared to last week, and kind of forget to zoom out and go, well, hang on, we did this session 2 months ago, and like, wow, look, that actually this is loads better, and just because this one on last Thursday wasn't a PB session, like, it's looking at that big picture, zooming out. And then the same thing from a training volume point of view. I think a lot of the time people look at it and go, oh, well, I'm feeling good this week, or I've got plenty of time this week, I'm going to bosh out this massive week, and then they're knackered and they need to have a recovery week the next week. And you see it so many times. Like, we definitely try and focus on the big picture and try. I really don't think there's a huge amount of point of looking at things in anything shorter than like a 3-month window. What have you done over the last 12 weeks? That's kind of the timescales that it takes to really make improve. You can see some changes in 6 weeks, but like really 12 weeks, what are that's the kind of the timescales, and even more so just over a year. We talk about, a lot of the guys talk about, 1,000 hours in a year being kind of like the minimum benchmark, because it's 20 hours a week times 50 weeks in a year with a couple of weeks off in the off season. But it doesn't sound much to do 20 hours a week, and we've got some athletes that are much more than that. But in order to achieve that, you have to have managed lots of other things. You need to have not got ill too much. You need to have managed your fueling, your sleep, your recovery. You've got to have your life optimized in a way that means that you're able to deliver that back to back to back. And so I think it's really looking at things in that macro level, that zoomed out bit, because that's really where you see the improvements, not so much in a week to week basis. So I suppose we would spend a lot of time from a coaching point of view, I suppose, like dragging athletes out from that really kind of that micro detail and going, hang on, look at this over this period, and look at where you were, look at where you've got to. This is the work you've done, or if they haven't achieved what they wanted to, like, this is the work you haven't done in the last. You had these 2 good weeks here, but this is your average over the last 3 months or 6 months. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, definitely. It does make sense. I want to go back to one of those things that you talked about there around in a group environment, not doing the session of the best person in the group for each individual. And I think there is this narrative in the sport now that, you need to, like, especially I think we've heard it a lot in swimming, that you have to go and train with like people that are better than you to get faster. But I think you hear it everywhere, like in triathlon, just getting a group, going and training with people that are better with you to get stronger. But I think, I don't know, tell me what you think, but I think that there's maybe some survivorship bias in that. I think that people do get better in the groups when the groups are well managed and it's not a race. So and that's maybe. But then if you just go and train in a group and it's just a race every day, or you're just training with the person that is faster than you doing their optimal training, and it's not your optimal training, and that's not at all the shortcut to success, and not the shortcut, but the pathway to success that it's sometimes made out to be.
Yeah, for sure. I think you'd probably find of every person that's got a successful example of doing it that way, you find at least one that was broken by that process. I think that probably comes from, I suppose, I'd say like an imperfect understanding of what the demands are and how you make people better, in my opinion. Like, and at the end of the day, someone has to be the best athlete in the group. So it's like, if you follow that to it's like, the nth degree, like it's not possible for like, everyone to do that all the time. I think, especially in a sport like ours, where you've got 3 disciplines, that is where your power of your group comes, because you've got these couple of athletes are the best swimmers, like these couple of athletes are the best riders, these couple of athletes are the best runners, and like usually they're not the same people in all of those, and so you can kind of have, that's where people can feed off of each other, and everyone hopefully has that bit that they have to offer, or they have to bring, or that bit where they feel like they're one of the stronger athletes and they're a bit more in control, and there's other bits of it where they're like, I'm coming to get a bit whipped today because this isn't my strongest discipline. But I think that's probably one of the benefits of triathlon is that blend of the sports, and therefore the blend of the strengths and weaknesses, and how you can, I suppose, get the most out of those people.
Yeah. And if it is well managed, so let's say that you're trying to work on your swim, you're trying to swim on the feet of somebody that is a stronger swimmer than you are, but it is still, the intensity is managed so that you're doing a hard swim, but the kind of hard that is right for you, then it makes it easier for you to do that. Psychologically speaking, it makes it easier for you to achieve that session in a group environment than for you to do it on your own. So then it becomes a huge benefit, but you still need to have some kind of management and of the intensity and of the load to not make it just a quick way to burning out basically or getting injured.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's probably one of the things that, myself and Oscar, the other coach in our group, we spend a huge portion of our time just working out what each person's going to do in this session and how that's going to fit with their plan, and then you've also got to do the part which is making sure that they understand what they're doing and why they're doing it, so that then they're bought into it. I think that's the biggest thing with that approach is if athletes understand why they're doing it, then they don't want to do the session that the other person's doing because they know it's not what they need.
Yeah, definitely. Let me see here. So that was the first question done. Okay, so the second question. In the context of elite short course racing, which is where you also started out as an athlete some time ago, I don't remember the years, but what do you think are the changes that have happened since you were an athlete yourself and also since you started coaching at the Performance Centre in Wales?
I think it's maybe stretching it to call me an elite short course athlete. Like I was. I
just called you an athlete. I didn't call you elite.
Okay, fair enough. I guess the really obvious one is the length of the race calendar. We used to race between May and September, and now you race between February and November. So if you race between May and September, that's 5 months or whatever. Then you've got 7 months where you do training, you get better, you have your recovery, you do your work, you do your nice big winter. And now we've got World Championships happening in Abu Dhabi at the end of November. You have 70.3 World Championships this year is in December. You have, WTS season starting at the start of March. And that length of calendar is a massive problem. I think it's a big problem for developing athletes because when you're already you've done the years of work and you're already at the top of your game, you can probably get away with that a bit less. But I think for the developing athletes, having the time where you're putting in the work and actually getting better rather than just racing all year, having recovery, do enough training to get back to the same level you were at the start of the last year and then cracking on with another season is quite a big challenge. I think the range of opportunities that there are there now with things like Super League and French Grand Prix and Bundesliga and the domestic Super Series and the ITU World Triathlon calendar, there's just so many different opportunities. And so being able to construct a coherent season that meets the athletes' objectives from a goals and their targets, but also being able to make a living and all of that kind of stuff is just a hell of a lot more complicated than it used to be. And then I think probably the other biggest theme that I have noted is the shortening of the race distances. So, I mean, if I was racing, but I think 2009 was the first elite sprint distance race. There was a World Championships for the sprint distance in 2009. It was the only sprint distance race in the World Triathlon calendar. And now probably the majority of the calendar are sprint distance races. I mean, certainly in Europe, we have 1, maybe 2, if we're lucky, Continental Cups per year out of 11 or 12 races that are Olympic distance. And then you've got relay, you've got Super League, you've got Zwift E-Tri, you've got lots and lots of events that are shorter. And so from that perspective, preparing athletes for the demands of that range of competition is quite difficult.
How do you tackle the problem, especially with the developing athletes, of having enough time to do the work with the extended season and racing calendar?
I suppose trying to convince them that they don't need to race every second week between February and November is the first step. And then I just think planning your year, setting out, I suppose, the different periods of it. I quite like back-to-back racing or race blocks. So you do a chunk of work, you race kind of, instead of racing, say, 3 or 4 times you race every 2 weeks for 8 weeks. I'd almost prefer someone to race three races in 4 weeks, so that then you can then spend the other 4 weeks out of that 8 weeks doing work again and getting fit again. And so I would try and kind of structure the year, if you can, if you got enough control over the race calendar, in a way that enables athletes to put in time. And I don't think a week or 2 weeks in between races is enough to do anything more than kind of tick over. I think you need those blocks of a 3-week gap or a 4-week gap to really kind of just top up the workload. And then I guess the other thing is just trying to manage the taper recovery process to depending on the priority level of the race, to I suppose minimize the amount of time lost from the training process over that period.
Yeah. I mean, we have similar things going on in long course triathlon as well, with an extended race calendar. And would you approach that in a similar way, with doing more like race blocks and then having chunks of time to work? Do you think that you can do that in the same way with actually racing back to back middle distance, let's say, and probably not full distance, but middle distance, or is it more challenging just because the race is so much longer and will probably demand a bit more recovery?
Yeah, it's tricky. I think it really depends on the individual, because some people find that because it's longer, the intensity is lower, therefore the damage is lower. And I think it depends on their profile. And some people recover actually a lot more quickly from a longer distance event. I would say Ironmans are different. If we ignore Ironman in that conversation, because that's a different beast. But yeah, from a 70.3 perspective, I think it's possible to race close together. You see quite a lot of athletes do it. You have to be on it from a recovery point of view. You have to have kind of got you have to get your execution right of the racing, because if you have a race where you blow up completely or whatever, then the recovery time is going to be a hell of a lot longer. But as opposed to one where you've kind of nailed your fueling and nailed your pacing, and you've finished kind of not comfortably, because you want to make sure you've emptied the tank in the race, but you've not kind of gotten to that place where you've done a lot of damage. But yeah, I mean, Josh is about to go and race Challenge Samarin at the weekend, and then race Krajci 70.3 the week after. So I'm not averse to that from the middle distance point of view. I think the principles, I don't think there's a huge difference, to be honest, between the Olympic distance and the middle distance, really, in terms of the way that you structure training or racing, or there's obviously some specific demands that are quite a lot different, but not. I don't think you need to necessarily change your approach like massively. Well, certainly we haven't, and we've managed to have some decent success with athletes transitioning between those two.
Yeah. So what are when you say the specific demands that are different, what are those things that you would say are different, and are there small details in training that you do differently to optimize, if you want to optimize for one versus optimizing for the other?
Yeah, I guess the obvious differences are I suppose the speed demands on the swim and the run are much higher in the short course racing, like mechanically, movement quality. The technical demands of group riding, of big, I would say, of big pack open water swimming, and then you see the start list for 70.3 Valencia, which had 91 men on it, and you go, well, that's basically the same as from an open water swimming and a pack swimming and all that kind of perspective. So But in general, yeah, the technical demands of open water swimming, of group riding, of cornering, circuit racing, that kind of thing. Those are much more specific to the short course. And then the bike's just the big one. And I would say the bike and the muscular conditioning for the longer distance. So you have to be able to ride and hold position. You have to be able to push out a certain number of watts and be able to hold it. And then you've got to have the muscular conditioning on the bike to be able to get off and run, and be able to kind of back that up over that period. So I think the biggest difference is the specifics of what you would do on the bike. Like our swim program, the long course guys do the exact same swim program that the short course guys do. The run, like, we make a couple of really minor tweaks, just lengthen out a couple of the sessions, maybe put a little bit more zone 2 LT1 stuff into the longer run than the short course guys do. But the swim and the run program are very similar. The bike's the one that's at certain points when they're specifically preparing for, from a racing perspective, is much more different.
And what are those things on the bike that, in terms of the program, the sessions that are different?
Well, just like longer sessions at lower intensity. So, whereas with for a short course athlete, you might have one session that's like more of a threshold based session that, might do your race specific stuff in there, but that's a session that like everyone can do. And then your other session, if you're doing two bike sessions in a week, we don't do that with everyone. But if you are, like, you then have the short course guys, they go one direction for it and do a higher intensity, shorter session, or even just some pure sprinting or some technical stuff with some sprints, that kind of thing. Whereas the long course guys, it's accumulate minimum 90 minutes, like ideally 2 hours, because that's how long they're going to be riding for, in and around that 17.3 race pace. So how you construct that up is there's a million ways of doing that, but it's basically just spending time at that power, in ideally, when you come into at least into the spring, spending it in position with the fueling, all of that kind of stuff. That's the biggest difference.
Yeah. What do you say that in the center you have junior athletes or under 23s? What is the younger age bracket that you have there?
18 is so when athletes come to university is the youngest. So yeah, we've got 18 to 32, I think, is our age range at the moment.
Yeah. So I want to ask about early specialization in the early days of triathlon. You had people coming in later on from either running or swimming background, maybe even a cycling background, and I think there is a trend more and more that people are now lifelong triathletes. Basically, they start pretty early. Is that something that you see, and is that something that is becoming more and more necessary, that it's basically an exception if an athlete can make it when they start later on as a triathlete? And now later on, I'm not talking about getting to the Olympics if you start at 25, but getting to the Olympics if you start at 18 versus if you start at 11. Like, do you see that trend, or what are your thoughts on early specialization in triathlon?
Yeah, definitely we see it. Like, there are more people that identify as triathletes earlier, as opposed to kind of coming to triathlon at 17, 18 as a swimmer or a runner, for example. But I definitely don't think it's necessary. I think it's possibly in a lot of respects is worse, because you see a lot of athletes that come in with, you could go back to the conversation about strengths and weaknesses, that like they do their training that's 3 swims, 3 bikes, 3 runs a week, and they're basically just okay at swimming, biking and running, and they're not actually good at any of them, as opposed to, for example, an athlete that comes in who's I've been swimming 9 times a week and running once and riding my bike once, and so I've got something that's actually, either at a world-class level or with the potential to develop to a world-class level. And I suppose, you talk about, getting to the Olympics when you start at 25. I mean, like, Beth Potter is an example.
I was thinking of her. I was thinking of her as the exception to what I was saying.
I mean, there's a few. Hugo Milner's been successful, coming in at 24, 25, I think he is. So yeah, I think it's I think that it's kind of swings and roundabouts. It's what you do with it, and it's I definitely don't think it's necessary to specialize earlier. I think if I could choose, I would rather they didn't than rather they did, if that makes sense. I would rather that you had an athlete that did swimming or running really well, and the other one not too bad. And then you don't really want a swimmer. Ideally, you don't really want a swimmer who's never done any running or land-based activity, because then you get a lot of lower limb problems. They maybe don't move so well on land. But if you've got a swimmer who's played hockey or netball or football or something like that, and they've at least done something on land with those kind of movement patterns, then great. Or if you've got someone like an Alex Yee, who was exceptional runner, like almost a non-swimmer at sort of 14, 15, and he's developed that really well.
But he started triathlon young, didn't he?
He did, but he was an exceptional runner. Is kind of what I'm saying. As opposed to like athletes who come in who have just done a little bit of everything, and it's much harder to then develop all of the things to the level and take something to be like a difference maker, to be a green line thing, to use the example we had earlier.
No, that makes sense. And it's, I mean, that's what the general research in early specialization in sport would say as well. I tend to agree with that. It's not really, in most sports, at least from what I know, it's not super beneficial, even in some cases. Like people are generally encouraged to do many different things.
I think the other thing on that, which is becoming more relevant though, is I sit there and go, oh well, you want to have someone who's a great swimmer or a great runner, and they did a bit of the other one. Like, the level of demands of cycling in our sport has gone through the roof in the last sort of 10 to 12 years, and that makes it that step harder to make that transition. And if you've never ridden a bike, you're not confident riding a bike. So I think that is probably the caveat to what I'm saying is, if you don't develop some of those bike skills early enough, or you just have an athlete that is willing to put in a hell of a lot of work and build up confidence and all of those kind of things to develop the riding, that can be a lot more difficult. Certainly more difficult than it used to be.
Yeah. Okay. So the other question here about the younger athletes in the program, or younger athletes coming into the program, are they? This is just me asking. I have no clue what the answer is here, but are they more knowledgeable about training than let's say 5-10 years ago? And does that help you as a coach, that they, I don't know, have picked up a lot of knowledge from reading, listening to podcasts, watching YouTube, those sorts of things?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. I'm not sure. I'd say that they're more knowledgeable about training in general, in a population level. I think that it's the same as it ever is, in the people that are curious and want to go out and find the information. Like, it's there. I would say the biggest difference is just the amount of stuff that is out there and how easy and accessible it is. And so I guess your job from a coaching point of view is to help people to develop a filter, an ability to kind of like think critically and understand the information they're getting, because it's really easy for a young athlete to go, oh, well, that person's good and they do these kind of sessions, so I want to do that. And it's just helping them to understand like the context of why that works for that person, or whether that would work for them. And I would say, from my point of view, it's much more fun when you work with athletes who want to go out and find stuff, and they come to you and they go, oh, can we, I've seen this, can you try this? And some of the time you go, no, my goodness, that's like completely not what you need to do. And you've got to help them understand why it is it wouldn't work for them or whatever. But those kind of, I suppose, get curious athletes who are invested in the sport and invested in themselves, and want to understand the things that are out there. I think that's really part of the fun part of coaching. Certainly when we started the program down here, it was we had a completely blank page, and it was we kind of explored stuff and created stuff together and worked out a direction to go in. And it was very much like, well, I've seen this, you've seen that, let's put this together, let's try that and see what happens and experiment and evolve, I suppose.
Yeah, no, that's a good answer. So let's move over a bit. No, sorry, one more question about the more elite or aspiring elite environment of your center. Are there any common mistakes that you see in athletes in this context, in the elite context?
I think quite a few of them I've probably spoken about already earlier, around sort of making lack of understanding of the purpose of what they're doing and why they're doing it. But then I wouldn't necessarily say that's common mistakes that the athlete makes. I mean, that's a coach's problem. Like, it's your job to help them to understand that. So if you can't or haven't, then you need to try and find a different way to do that. So, but I think that's super important, just from a buy-in, from a development, from a maximizing the effect that they get out of any session or decisions that they take. I think, we talked about intensity control. So either doing too much hard stuff, not doing the right type of hard stuff, or I think the biggest one is thinking that you're doing something, but you're actually doing something else because you've decided that you're doing threshold, but you're actually doing it, 20 watts too hard. So now it's not threshold, and it's not what you think it is. So, that kind of, that combined with the one that I said about ego and doing sessions where you want to be. Well, I would like my threshold to be 350 watts, so I'm gonna ride 350 for this session, and it's like, well, now you're not doing what the session was intended, and it's not doing what you need. And then I guess a couple of other points I noted was one kind of trying to improve everything all the time. Like, triathlon's so complicated, 3 sports, within each of the sports, like a whole range of different technical, physiological demands. Like, you just cannot improve everything all at the same time. It's certainly not when you're working with athletes that have got some history in the sport. Like, if you start working with a relatively new athlete, then you can kind of give them anything and they'll get better as long as they don't get injured, because like everything's a new stimulus to them. But I think being very deliberate about what you're trying to focus on and why you're trying to focus on it at a specific point in time, and being okay with, well, we're trying to move the biking on, and therefore we can't push the running at the same time, and we're just going to have to block that focus through the year. And then the last one I've put was around impatience, and I'd say that kind of links to the conversation we had around focusing on the micro level versus the macro level. And I think it's way easy to underestimate the amount of time that it takes to make changes and to make improvements. And I think I say without generalizing, I'm definitely generalizing. Like, athletes are quite, in general, are quite perfectionist. They're quite, they're driven. It's part of what makes them good, is that striving for the next thing to be, for the next level. But that bit of, but this is going to take this whole year, or this is going to take us 2 years to get your swim to the level that we want it to be, and being able to invest in something for that length of time. And I suppose linked to that is, in our kind of world and our kind of funding model, it's you see a lot of the time athletes will get to the end of university, so they've had their student loan or maybe a bit of parent support to get through university. They're 21, 22, they're 6 to 8 years away from their physical peak for our sport. So how do you support yourself if you're not on the world-class funding, if you don't have something like someone funding you to do the sport? It's really hard for them to justify, but I'm going to invest this 8 years that it's going to take to get myself through that period to really see my maximum potential. And you see them kind of do it, and they're like, oh, I need to achieve this in this year to like justify continuing. And you're like, wow, this is going to take you 4 years. I really, really want you to do it. And the people that, some of the older guys in our squad are really great examples of people who, if you looked at them when they were 23, 24, 25, you just be like, well, there's not a lot there, kind of thing. They've not done a lot. But, they've found a way, whether it's through, different avenues of support or working part-time while they do it. And they found a way to get themselves to the point where now they're 28, 29, 30, and they're performing at a level that, they never, most people never would have thought that they could have got to if they hadn't given themselves that time. And I think that's a big challenge for us. I think it's definitely something that I wrestle with, because you see it a lot where athletes are kind of out of the sport at 24, 25, and I'm like, but yeah, you just needed a couple more years. And it's hard, because it's not, I don't have the answers to it, because there's a lot of societal pressure, there's a lot of for like financial pressure on being able to do that. But I just wish we could find a way to help athletes through that period, because I think we'd see a lot more athletes fulfilling their potential if that was the case.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting one for sure. And I guess having some role models that in the squad that have gone through that and have found that success after many years of patience and figuring out how to do it, that's at least that can only help. But if it's enough, that's a different question for the athletes that are now younger and in that position where they have to make a decision whether to continue or not. Yeah. But let's move on a bit to some age group specific questions. What would you say are the main differences between training principles or considerations for age group athletes compared with elite athletes?
Yeah, I think the commonalities are actually far more. There's much more frequent commonalities than there are differences, to be honest. Like, a lot of the same principles apply. But I guess if you're talking about differences, the main one, like time, is an obvious one. I think people kind of have this concept of, oh, well, they're an elite athlete, a professional athlete, they've got all this time to train. And you go, I mean, certainly the athletes in my group at our level, like most of them are either working part-time or they're studying part-time as well alongside it. I think we've got probably about 2 athletes that are genuine, like they are full-time professionals, if that makes sense. And so it, in that sense, it's probably not as black and white as it would appear on paper, but definitely, for most age group athletes, the time constraint and the level of demand on their time with work, family, other, just all of those other things means that you've got to be much more deliberate about what you're doing. For sure. I think that comes with a little bit of like a flip side. So, I think what that helps is that you would see a lot of the athletes would have a bit more balance and a bit more perspective on life, a bit more life experience. And, we'd find a lot with some of the elite athletes that, because they're kind of all in on sport, then it becomes a much more tied up in their identity. And I don't think that's always a good thing, if that makes sense. I think for the age group athletes, just having a bit more perspective on things, it can be really beneficial from a performance point of view. And then I suppose the other real main one would be just the breadth of background, starting points, goals. Like, we talked earlier about, in the elite level, there's all these different options, there's all these different like goals, but like fundamentally the demands of performing at the top level are fairly narrow. Even whether you're talking about Super League or sprint distance world triathlon or PTO or whatever, that's still a fairly narrow band of like what you're trying to achieve. Whereas your starting point and your end point for an age group athlete can be like enormously different, and so I think that's probably one of the biggest differences.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. And about the time availability, what are some of the ways that an age group athlete can make their training as time efficient, or make their life more time efficient, things that you think work well for an age grouper to get the most bang for buck from a time perspective with their training?
Yeah, so I'd say linked to some of the stuff we've talked about already, just be super clear on the purpose of each session and make sure you're actually delivering what the session is intended, so you're not, inverted commas, wasting time. I think on that front, getting into the meat of your main sets quickly, like you don't need a lot of fluff. If you haven't got a lot of time, then, you know, cut down the fluff around your main set and make sure you kind of deliver that. Whether it's, you know, not saying it has to be hard, but just like whatever the main point of that session, the main purpose of it, like get stuck into that and use the majority of your time for that as much as possible. And then make sure that you're planning your week around the key sessions and giving yourself the kind of maximum chance of that being successful. So, you know, there's no point if you know that, I know Tuesday is like the busiest day of your work week, and, you know, you never get off until 7 p.m. But, you know, Tuesday in a normal triathlon program that's run session day. So, you know, well, I need to do a run session this day. It's like, well, that's not realistic. Or even if it is, you're doing your run session at 8 o'clock, 8:30, you're knackered. You're not going to get the quality that you want out of it. So I think it's just, you know, that optimization of the week to go where regardless of whatever my commitments are, whatever, you know, whether that's family, work, whatever, like where am I going to be able to perform my best during the week, and then put your most important sessions in those slots and then kind of backfill from there. I think that would be important. And then also I would say don't underestimate the value of the little bits that you can tack on. You know, if you can ride to work and it's 25 minutes or 30 minutes, like, well, you know, even if you ride to and from work 3 days a week, well, that's 3 hours more of riding that you've got into your program for, you know, maybe it takes 10 minutes longer than it does to drive or to get the bus or whatever it is. It's like, you know, you can build that up. And, you know, even with some of the athletes that we work with, there's, you know, if they haven't got a car and they're right, it's amazing the amount of like extra, you know, commuting time that they rack up. And I wouldn't underestimate that. And if you can find a way of kind of integrating that into your training and like using that to just boost the volume up a little bit, then I think that can be quite an efficient way of doing things. And I think it's definitely not as at that level. You know, when you're talking about, you know, an athlete that might do 8, 10, 12 hours a week, like all of a sudden adding on 2 or 3 hours it's a huge percentage. Like it's more beneficial than it is, you know, than a lot of other things could be, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember before I got into triathlon, when I was still at university, but also working part-time, my work was pretty much exactly a half marathon away from where I lived. And I was at that point getting into running doubles. And I would, once per week, I would run to work. But then several other days of the week, I would run about half of the way and then jump on a bus from half of the way, or the other way around. And then after work, I would do my second run session. And it's just because obviously working part-time and doing university and trying to train quite a bit, the time demands were quite high. So I figured that, well, that was the only way that I would have time to do it. But yeah, I definitely think that using the commute can be, I don't know, for me, it's probably the most biggest tip for being time efficient and getting in some extra training that you might not even have thought of that you have time for. Are there, other than the unnecessary fluff potentially that you already mentioned, are there any other things that you think that age groupers should not waste their time with, that it's just not worth it, or it's distracting from the things that matter?
I would say I think it just comes back to, like, if you're time crunched, then all of the things that we talked about earlier are around the clarity of the purpose, understanding your strengths and weaknesses and prioritizing. Like, that just becomes like even more important. Like, at least kind of, if I'm working with athletes that can train 25, 30 hours a week, it's much easier to fit in all of the things like a bit. Whereas I think for most people, like I wouldn't say there's like really there's loads of things that I'm like, oh yeah, that's pointless, because like for any individual, it depends on what their strengths and weaknesses are, what their goals are, and like it might be really important for them. But I think just that hierarchy and that prioritization of what are the most important things, and putting, building the week around them, and making sure that those things, you're in the best shape to do that. I think that's it, all of that just becomes much more heightened rather than compared to coaching elite athletes, I suppose.
Yeah. And I guess we can then put lack of clarity, lack of purpose as one mistake to avoid. Are there any other mistakes to avoid that you would point out for age groupers?
Yeah, I really think that when I was thinking about this question, I was like, the answers are just the same, but like I said, even more so than with elite athletes. So I definitely think the temptation is, well, I train less, so I should just go hard all the time. I mean, that is, a common, if I'm only doing 12 hours, well, then I can just go hard all the time. And I don't think that, from my understanding of physiology, like that's not how it works. What you can probably do if you're training less is do your aerobic stuff a little bit more solid. But that means you don't go over LT1. When I say aerobic stuff, that's things below LT1. But so whereas if I've got an elite athlete who's riding 15 hours a week on the bike, well then it kind of you can just be steady on your aerobic work, because you kind of build up all that conditioning just from the time in the saddle. And if you go really solid all the time, then muscularly that's really damaging. Like metabolically, you require a huge amount of fuel, whereas if you're doing much less volume, you can push that aerobic stuff a little bit harder, I would say, as long as you don't cross the threshold. And I think that kind of comes back to my point, which is I would say your threshold work is king, but like make sure that you're actually doing what you think you're doing. Whatever method that you use to kind of calculate your training zones, or whether you get physiology testing or whatever it is, like make sure that what you think you're doing is what you're actually doing, because then you're not going to waste time.
And what is your recommendation? How do you, as an age grouper, figure out where should I do my threshold work?
Yeah, the gold standard for it is to do lactic testing, and it's relatively accessible now. That there's, I would say, most universities that have a sports science department will offer that service to the public. Obviously there's a cost implication to that, and so you can do some reasonable estimations using various kind of models on depending on which kind of schools you might ascribe to, whether you look at the critical power testing, those kind of things. Those things are better than nothing, but they're a lot worse than getting actual sort of lactic and gas tested. So I mean, if at all possible, I think that would be by far one of the best investments people could make, more than buying a £3,000 set of wheels, or a super aero bottle for their bike. Like, you get way more performance benefit from knowing what training zone you're meant to be training in, and then doing your training at that intensity.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think with age groupers, that's where you have very results sometimes that are not at all intuitive. So an elite athlete with a long background in endurance sports, that LT2 is going to be within a fairly narrow margin of critical power, usually below, but let's say 10 to 20 watts below or so. And that's so you can easily get away with field tests there, also just based on actual the feeling of the athlete. But in age groupers, I think that you can. I generally don't. I generally don't recommend very often to do lab tests, but I definitely see the point, because especially if you are an age grouper that comes from let's say a team sport background or something, and you're fairly new into triathlon, you might have these profiles that are really on the extreme ends, where you might be running above threshold, but it feels super easy because you just have such a massive anaerobic sure. engine, and these are the situations where you could easily get yourself into overtraining or so if you don't really know what's going on metabolically. So I think that for an age grouper, it's often actually more useful than for an elite athlete to do those things.
Yeah, I think like I don't necessarily think you need to get physiology tested every 6 weeks or 10 weeks or whatever. It's not once a year, amazing, like twice a year, like incredible. Like you don't. I don't think you need more than that. It's just to set and once you've done a couple, you get and you've got a little bit of training background, things start to stabilize. So I can pretty much for the athletes that I've worked with for a reasonable period of time, you can things stabilize around sort of heart rate zones and things like that, and so I could have a really good stab at where an athlete is based on their historical data, based on what we're seeing from the training powers and heart rates and paces and stuff. You can go, okay, well, this is where I think threshold LT1, LT2 are right now, and then your testing just becomes that's more than a nice to have to just validate what you think you're seeing from there. But certainly when you're starting out, to get a couple of those in to get just get really clear anchors, and just like I said, just make sure that when you're using the limited, relatively more limited time that you have available, that you're getting the absolute most out of each minute that you've got to work with, I suppose.
And this may or may not be related to testing. Let's see. But what would your recommendation be for how to approach pacing for long distance triathlons, so 7.3 and Ironman distance? How do you structure a good pacing strategy for age groupers?
Yeah, I would say get tested. Be really clear what the metabolics are, because once you go into a long course, like fundamentally it's a fuel usage and fuel in work out kind of equation, and so if the more understanding that you have of that, the better. If you can't do that, because I appreciate, like I said, it has a cost implication, and doing some estimate of whether through some sort of field test to be like, okay, this is where I think FTP or LT2 or whatever it is, and then regardless of where you've got your number from, then doing a bunch of session delivery and kind of recalibrating things to versus what you can actually do. Because even if you have like a gold standard of a physiology ramp or whatever, where you do, I don't know, 8 times 5 minutes or 6 minutes or whatever, and that's for any athlete, age group or elite or whatever, that's very different doing 1 5-minute effort at a given power to like sitting at it for 4 hours for an Ironman bike leg, or for 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever, for a 70.3 bike leg. So I think constructing some sessions that you then kind of validate, whether it's your field test or your lab test against, and then almost like the most important of them being I really like a simulation session or simulation weekend. So I've done quite a few times where you get people to ride the full race distance, and maybe they'll do on, say, a Saturday, you ride the full race distance and you run 10k off it, and then the next day you ride a half the race distance and run a bigger portion of the run off it, that kind of thing, just so you're accumulating that work and you're seeing what's sustainable. and then you should be able to have some idea of what is actually going to be possible come race day.
Yeah. And can you give 2 general tips within each discipline, within swimming, biking, and running, for how age groupers might be able to improve their performance? So this might be training related, or it might be something else. For example, within biking, we have heard answers like get a good bike fit. So just to give an example.
So you want 2 of each discipline?
2 of each discipline.
Yeah. So I guess for swimming, absolute number 1 is that join a club or get a coach that can see you on deck, like on at least a regular basis, like whether that's once a week or more frequently or whatever. Just technically, swimming is too difficult without it for most triathletes, especially unless they've come from a really strong swim background when they're younger. So then they know how to swim and they can just go and swim up and down themselves. But for the vast majority of triathletes, especially age group triathletes, I think joining a club or some sort of setting where you can have a coach watch you swim and give you feedback and help you develop in that is important. And then linked to that, the absolute number 1 is the technical is way more important than the physiological for swimming than compared to any of the other disciplines. Like, and I mean, in absolutely no disrespect to triathletes, but there's 10-year-old girls in most clubs that can swim fast, in most swim clubs that can swim faster than the majority of triathletes. And that's not because they're really big, strong and powerful. It's because they're, really hydrodynamic and well balanced in the water and all of those kind of things. So I think, on the swimming, like that focus on the technical is really important. And then I'd probably flip that when I talk about the cycling, because I would say the number 1 thing would get a power meter or ideally both physiology testing, but certainly get a power meter. It's the opposite to swimming. It's almost entirely physiological, and input work output is the equation is much more simple, as long as you don't just go and crash it into a barrier on the first corner because you are that awful at technical. But like fundamentally, the cycling is a relatively simple physiological endeavor. So for cycling, I would much more prioritize the physical abilities and the physical training, and then like linked to that, I would say bike fit, and not just bike fit, but like riding in the position. You can do a bike fit and you can be like, this is amazing, this position is super aero, and you can hold it for 10k, and then you've got 80k of sitting up on your base bars and not traveling very fast, because you in order to go after 20 watts more of aerodynamics, you've sacrificed 80 kilometers of not being able to hold that position. Or even if you do hold that position, you then get off and can't run because you can't get out of that position, and you in that sense. So I think that would be the second one for cycling. Run wise, I think really careful load management is the biggest thing. The consistency and the aerobic work, being able to run frequently is way more important than any specific session you do or any big week of volume that you do. We've got one of the younger athletes that in our group now is he came in, is his first year with the squad. He'd done a bit of sessions. He kept kind of getting little niggles and stuff. And so in February, we took him off sessions. It was just like, we're just going to build you up aerobically. He did no sessions. And he ran a 3:57 for 1500 and then ran 15:05 off the bike in his first triathlon of the year.
Nice.
So, and he like literally, when I say like he's done no sessions, like he's literally done no sessions. And so it's just that management of the load, if you can be consistent, is way more important than anything specific that you do in your run training.
And just out of curiosity, because that's such a nice example, what has his run volume been, or what have you built him up to in terms of kilometers per week, and what does he do? What pace is his aerobic runs generally around?
Good question. It's actually Oscar that lead coaches on him, but I think we've only kind of really built him to about 50k a week, but consistently 50k a week. And most of our guys don't really run quicker than 5 minutes a k. So it's like somewhere between 4:40, 4:45, and 5 minutes a k, depending on how fresh they feel and how often they're running or whatever. But it would be very rare that anyone ran certainly inside of 4:30 a k for aerobic stuff.
Yeah.
And
all right.
Second one for running would be linked to that, just good injury prevention plan, like basic S&C, movement quality, especially if you're from a limited run background. Like if you're a swimmer or you've not done much running, running is the biggest injury risk in the sport of triathlon. It's where we see the most time lost from a training perspective, and the biggest performance detriment is if you get injured. So basically, like, rule number one, don't get injured. Everything else comes far, far below that from a running perspective.
Yeah, and on that, I might add good decision making, because I see that's such a big part of it, in terms of you feel a little niggle, stop the session there. Don't push through the last two intervals. And I'm saying this having done this mistake many times. But yeah, make good decisions. A day lost or a couple of days lost now is much better than a couple of weeks lost a couple of days later. So I think that's a really big one as well with the injury prevention aspect.
Yeah.
So let's move on to some general reflective questions about your coaching. So the first one is, what is something that you're trying to learn more about or focus on at the moment or recently?
I think swimming in general, but specifically like triathlon swimming, I think it's just really complicated. There's just so many facets to it, of physiology, technical, race skills. There's I think it's the discipline that's got the biggest breadth of demands and skill sets, especially for the short course racing. Like, you need to have a good enough get out speed, you need to have a high enough threshold, you need to be able to handle group dynamics, you need to be able to not just swim really well, but you've got to get out and do T1, and the first bit of the bike is such a defining factor in short course racing. And you've got the technical challenge of the pool versus the open water. We've got people that are great pool swimmers, and then you've got people that look a complete mess in the pool but beat them out of the water in open water because of that skill set. And then I also think you've got the factor of in general, we spend less time on swimming, albeit, for elite athletes, you swim quite a lot. You're swimming 25, 30k a week, but relative to, say, cycling, you're spending probably half the time that you would in the bike program. And so you've got to balance all of that in this relatively limited time, and in a way that you get, I find anyway, you get a lot less of a crossover from the cycling and running to the swimming than you do between the other two disciplines. You can do some stuff on the bike that has a real big benefit to the run and vice versa, but they don't really translate back over to the swimming. So I think just trying to nail down that different balance of those different demands in the swimming is, I'd say, is my big question at the moment.
All right. And if you could magically give yourself great skill or knowledge in 3 specific things, what would you choose?
Am I allowed to say mind reading? Because you did say it was a magical skill. So I would say just in a whole range of coaching scenarios, or just in life in general, if you knew actually what the other person was thinking or experiencing or understanding about what you say, or what you do, then you could much more easily tailor your what you're delivering, how you're delivering it to meet their needs. So I'd say mind reading, and then I would say, like, probably linked to that as well, communication. So just if there was a way that you could communicate exactly what the athlete needed to understand, and they would interpret it exactly how you had intended to communicate it, because that's where a lot of the time you see some of the challenges. From a coaching point of view, is you think you've done a great job of explaining it, and then they go off and they do something, and you're just like, that is not anything like what we talked about. And then they're like, yeah, but this is how I understood it. And you're like, well, that makes complete sense why you did it like that, but that's really not what I was intending. So if you could combine those two things of mind reading and being able to do perfect communication and interpretation from an athlete's perspective, that I think that would be brilliant. And if you did those, and then I had my third one would be just applied physiology, because fundamentally, like I said, we're still an engine sport. The top level of the sport's getting closer to the limits of human performance. So if you had amazing communication, mind reading skills, and like a perfect understanding of applied physiology on both a kind of group and individual basis, I think you'd be pretty unbeatable from a coaching perspective.
Yeah. And if you could go back in time to an earlier point in your coaching career and give yourself some advice, what would you say?
I would say first thing would be make sure you find a way of internally validating or setting criteria for whether you're doing a good job from a coaching point of view, beyond, I guess, just sort of athlete outcomes or results or other people's opinions. So there's just so much that's outside of your control as a coach. If you can't validate your own process, then it's easy to kind of lose perspective on things and think that you're the best thing since sliced bread if your athletes are doing well, but also that you're terrible and you don't know anything if the athletes aren't. And so just being able to validate your own process and setting less outcome based, it's all the things that you would say to an athlete, is setting process objectives and being able to validate performance against that. Is definitely something I wasn't that good at a few years back. And then I think in this kind of role, just if you get a good team around you, just trust them and let them get on with their jobs. I would say maybe some people would probably say I still am, but I definitely, when I was younger, was a massive control freak. And that just meant I was focused on so much stuff that I wasn't the expert in, and I was spending so much time on that and not really, in the area that should be my expertise. And we've got an amazing coach and sports science team, and so really it's just my job to set the direction that we're going in, and just let them get on with the bits that they're really good at. That'd probably be the main two things.
Can you give some insight into how you now do that internal validation of the work you do as a coach?
Yeah, I think it's relatively like personal, like from an individual perspective, but it's just it's just kind of looking at things not so much with, I guess, hindsight bias and going, did I make the best decision with the information that I had available at the time, and did I same as you'd say with an athlete, it's like did you do your best? Was I as prepared as I could be? Did I put the appropriate amount of effort into this process? So those kind of things, I think, just it's all the same stuff as you would talk about with an athlete. It's maybe a bit less objective when you're talking about a lot of the things that are involved in coaching versus there's a lot more like kind of objective outputs that you would get on the athlete side, I suppose.
Yeah. And what is the best or most influential book or books, if you want to mention several, that you've read?
Yeah, I would say they're really simplistic, but when I started down here, like I said before, we had a complete blank slate. Like I could do whatever I wanted from the program. And so there was no where to start other than a bit like, well, this is what I used to do, or this is what we did in Loughborough, which is where I trained and coached before. And the two sort of models that I started with was Daniel's running formula and training and racing with a power meter, the Andy Colgan's book. And like that just gave me a framework to start with and to experiment from. Like, it gave me some just grounding and they're very generalistic. Like, I think we've probably moved away a fair bit from the specifics of what's in them, but just the impact that had on just giving us a structure of which to work with and to experiment from, and to that principle, that underpins both of them around understanding demands and, like, test to get your level and work out your zones and stuff off of that. Like, I've definitely carried that principle forward in all of my coaching, even if I haven't stuck with the specifics of the methodology or the sessions or whatever. Yeah, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So now let's have a new section for the podcast, which is a Would You Rather coaching edition. So first of all, in swim training, would you rather always use 100s or shorter distances, or always 400s or longer distances for all of your reps for eternity, for your athletes, that is?
Nice. Yeah, that one I think is quite easy. Always hundreds or shorter. I think swimming's just so technical that you can be so creative with how you structure sessions, rest intervals, all that kind of stuff, that, like, obviously you wouldn't want to do either, but if I had to choose, the hundreds would. I think you could do everything that you need to, and for the majority of athletes, they would perform better if you broke them down in that way.
And in bike training, would you rather you do only outdoor training but with no power meter? And for the purpose of this question, we assume good weather, good terrain, and traffic and road conditions. Or would you rather do only indoor training with a power meter?
Okay. So outdoors, no power meter, but you can pretty much do what you want. Indoors, only a turbo, but you can use power meter. I think the answer to that is different whether you're talking about short course or long course athletes. Long course athletes, indoors, the specificity of the work, the conditioning, the pacing, the understanding of all of that, I would do on the turbo with the power meter, and just hope they didn't crash on the first corner. Short course, you just can't meet the demands of the sport just only training indoors, like especially draft legal. The technical demands, the group skills, and so I'd only train outside, and you'd find a way to work without your power meter.
Yeah. And in run training, would you rather never run on the track versus never run hills, completely flat running always?
Never run track. We don't run like a massive amount of track in our program anyway. I think there's plenty you can do with a decent flat road surface, and so I wouldn't the track is nice for certain things and we use it for specific things, but if someone told me I'm never allowed to use a track again, it wouldn't fundamentally change much about what I do.
And for long course racing, would you rather not be allowed to use a bike computer or not be allowed to use a GPS watch? So this implies that you have no data on the bike versus no data on the run.
Yeah,
to be clear.
No data on the run. I think that's quite an easy one. I think because the run is much more affected by all the things that have come before around nutrition and pacing and all of that kind of stuff. Whereas the bike, if you get those things wrong, then you're in for it doesn't matter what your watch is saying. If you've screwed up the 2, 3, 4, 8 hours that have gone before it. So and also the run's just so affected. If you're talking about GPS watch, like it's so much affected by the course, the terrain, the conditions, the race dynamics. It's like that would change so much based on that anyway. So definitely I would rather have the bike data.
Yeah. And for an age grouper, just in general, for 12 hours per week or of training or more, would you rather always train with 0 grams an hour of carbohydrates versus always train with at least 100 grams? for our own carbohydrates.
I mean, I don't think either of them is optimal, but I suppose that's the point. But I definitely can't in good conscience come on here and recommend triathletes to deliberately underfuel in a sport that's fundamentally, most people spent underfueled by accident anyway. So I'd go with the 100 grams an hour.
Yeah, I actually think I wrote this question wrong. It would make more sense if it was 12 hours per week of training or less, then it would be. I would
still not in good conscience recommend people to deliberately underfuel them. So my answer would be the same.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that answer, even with that change condition. But I think it's a slightly more interesting thought experiment, because otherwise it's just a no-brainer.
Yeah.
And the final one, for racing in Kona and arriving from the UK, would you rather arrive 10 days before but no other heat prep, or arrive 7 days before but you can do as much heat prep as at home as needed, and resources are not an issue? You can use a heat chamber and everything.
Okay. I would do the 7 days and heat prep at home. I just don't think 3 days is enough to make that difference. I think if you started asking 2 weeks or 3 weeks, maybe, as the arrive before, I think that's the amount of time that you would need on the ground if you'd done no heat prep before. So if you asked it like with a longer time scale, I'd be a bit more on the fence. But I think with only 3 days difference between the two options, definitely be heat prep at home for about 7 days.
Yeah, I spent some time thinking about which days to choose here. I think I chose 7 days, as that's around the time when, coming from the UK, the time zone would also be you'd maybe be a little bit on that level where ideally you would want a bit more time to adapt to the time zone difference. But I think
if you have good jet lag strategy, I think you can. We went to Yokohama, and that was 5 days. Landed 5 days, 4 days before the race. So I think it's I think if you're clear about what you're doing, if that's the constraint you're under, I think you can overcome that.
Yeah. No, that's a good answer. And so the final question, I'm not going to ask it the way that it normally is, the Olympic triathlon picks, but we talked about this, and because you have some involvement there, you don't want to pick. But I want to ask you then, how do you think the dynamics will play out a little bit in the men's and the women's race?
Yeah, okay. I think I would say in general terms from the racing, the big question for both the men's and the women's race is, will there be a split? We've got a river swim, which is pretty unusual from World Triathlon perspective. Gives it a different dynamic. There's a fast bike course. And so the big kind of question that I suppose everyone who's coaching athletes that are going to be or want to be at that games is that swim bike going to split or not? And I think if I were betting on it, I would say the men is unlikely. I just think there's too much willingness and strength further down the field, and there's the congestion of where of the swim is quite high. There's we're not in the era where we had Richard Varga or Henry Schumann at like full kind of swim velocity, where it's kind of splitting the field up. And also I've not seen evidence that the front of that men's race can get organised quickly enough with the limited spread that there is on the field to prevent them kind of catching back on. I would say the men probably not. I think the women, almost certainly there will be a split. The big question then is how many, because we've seen most women's races split in over the last 4 to 6 years, but there's been a big kind of variation in the number, and we've seen sort of 15 to 20, and we've also seen 5 or 6. Obviously Jess Learmonth was a big factor in the last cycle, and same thing from a swimming perspective, really stretching that out, and that meant that the breaks tended to be a lot smaller in size. But she's not there at the moment. So I think it really just depends on where the key players like Flora and Taylor Knibb get out of the water, and how quickly they kind of get up to speed and hit full gas. And that will probably determine whether we're seeing a sort of a race on the run between the strongest runners out of the swim bikers versus some of the more pure runners staying in the race and being a bit more of a run race. Like I don't think you're not going to get away in that women's race without being able to swim and bike pretty well, because I can't see the split being bigger than 20. That's about the most we've seen in recent years. But I think that's probably the question: is will there be a split? Where will it come? I think regardless, we're going to see fast run times from both men's and women's events. You look at the test event, you look at Yokohama, it's pretty close to 29 flat for the men to win, and there's been the women are sort of running just inside 33 flat, that kind of thing. So we're probably looking at some quick run times to win that. Albeit it does put into perspective just how good Alistair's performance was in London 2012. That was a 29:07 for the 10K, kind of jogging down the finish chute with the flag, not in carbon shoes. And we're talking about 12 years later, the winning time somewhere in that kind of ballpark. So it does put that kind of into context where that performance sits.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. It really does. I know that was good. Everybody can go and make a snack during the men's bike, probably. But then the run,
I wouldn't go for sure. But I would say just on the evidence of what we've seen over the last couple of cycles, you've got some really big bike power that tends to be further down the field on the swim. Whereas the women's race, you tend to have the biggest bike power is within the first 10 to 15 out of the water. So I think it's pretty much on that basis that I would predict it, one to split and one to not, I suppose.
Yeah. All right. Well, Luke, this has been really fun. Thank you so much. And can people follow you anywhere? Are you on social media or something?
No, there's a short answer to that. But you can follow our athletes, our group. So would be on Instagram, NTPC Wales. And you'll find, if you go through that, you'll come across some of the athletes in the squad, or on the Welsh Triathlon Twitter and Instagram account. So that would be Triathlon Cymru. I'm sure you can stick those in the notes. Or whatever.
I will. All right. Thank you, and speak soon. Bye-bye.
Cool. Cheers.
I hope that you enjoyed that interview. As always, you can find the show notes on scientifictriathlon.com. This was a long interview, so I'll be brief, but I want to highlight a couple of things from this episode that I think are really worth repeating. And the first one is about patience, which Luke talked about in several instances. A quote here that comes to mind is that we overestimate what we can do in a year, but we underestimate what we can do in 10. And I think that the corollary to that is sometimes that in endurance sport, at least, maybe elsewhere, because of the fact that we overestimate what we can do in 1 year or 1 month or 1 week, take your pick, we underachieve compared to our potential over 10 years or over any longer time period. So if you want short-term improvements, then almost anything goes. But if you want medium and long-term improvements, then you really need that patience. You need to chip away at things slowly but slowly. And this leads me to the second highlight from this episode, which I think is really important to be able to have that patience, and that is to look at the big picture. Luke actually used the exact same example that I like using for this concept, numbers and all, because I just think that it illustrates things quite nicely. And that was the example of how to reach 1,000 annual training hours. Now, side note, we're never chasing hours. That's not the point, but it does illustrate this concept nicely. So 20 hours per week for 50 weeks of the year, that is 1,000 annual training hours. And in the context of elite triathlon, 20 hours doesn't sound like much or like it's that difficult to achieve. But 1,000 annual training hours, that is a very respectable amount, even in the context of elite athletes. So basically, the point of this example is that 20 hours per week can seem like not that much when we zoom in at the weekly level or even a monthly level. But when we zoom out at an annual level, it suddenly looks like quite a lot for most people, even at the elite level, when we start going back and look at, well, what did an athlete how much did they actually train in any given year? And to get to 1,000 hours, that is quite a lot. It's not something that everybody achieves, even if they're racing at a very high level. And it's for some people, they don't need that. It would maybe be too much, but that's not the point. The point is that looking at things from a more zoomed out perspective, things look very different than looking at things from a zoomed in perspective. So this doesn't apply to just volume. This is just an example that is quite clear, but it applies to things like, you can apply it to anything you want, but intensity, rest and recovery, workout design, periodization, and of course, things outside of triathlon as well. So remembering to be patient and to look at the big picture rather than the small details, to not see the forest for the trees. That's, I guess, the example that comes to mind here when we talk about looking at the big picture. And we want to see the forest and not let the trees obscure our view. So those two things are what I want to leave you with as main takeaways from today. Now, let me take just a minute to promote what we do at Scientific Triathlon. So we do coaching, training plans, consultations, also customized training plans. And I often talk about the massive impact that coaching can have. And it really can. But I know that not everybody can or want to invest in individual coaching because it is, of course, a pretty significant expense. And this is where ready-made training plans can be a great option. I'm a big believer that even though completely individualized training is the gold standard, most athletes still train so far from optimally that they can actually see huge improvements from just a good standardized plan. Ideally, you use knowledge that you gain from this podcast to tweak a good standardized plan to fit your individual needs. But having a good or a great starting point can be a massive benefit. So as an example of this, the latest review that came in for one of our plans was from Nick, 53 from Australia, who had previously used our intermediate half-distance plan, and now for his latest race, he used the advanced half-distance plan. Nick rated the plan 10 out of 10 and wrote that he, quote, increased in speed across all three disciplines, swimming from 210 per 100 for a 1K time trial to 202 per 100. Bike from 235 watts to 255 watts for FTP, in parentheses 91% of 20-minute power. So there you go. I think that for somebody who is already in that intermediate to advanced bracket, running 1:42:20 for a half distance run at 53 years old, those are very impressive, very substantial improvements. So I'm really glad to see that. I'm also well chuffed with that. And if you would like to get some help with your triathlon performance, but can't quite justify the investment in coaching, then consider this a good option. Check out our plans on scientifictriathlon.com/plans. And the chances are that you too could benefit from these plans like Nick did. In the next episode of the podcast, I have the interview with Dirk Friel, co-founder of Training Peaks. So look out for that in 1 or 2 weeks' time and hit that subscribe button if you are not already subscribed. And finally, big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Fuel and Hydration, that you can find on precisionfuelandhydration.com. If you're looking for high quality, practical and tasty fueling and hydration products, make sure to try Precision Fuel and Hydration. There are a range of options from drink mix to gels to chews, so you can easily find your personal favorite. And don't forget to take 15% off your first order with the code TTS24. And thank you to Zen8. The Zen8 Swim Trainer is a great tool to have in your toolbox to improve your technique and power, to target specific aspects of your stroke, and to maintain consistency when you don't have time to get to the pool. You can try the Zen8 risk-free for up to 30 days and get 20% off your first order on zen8swimtrainer.com/TTS. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.